Diep had never imagined that joy could arrive quietly, slipping into her life the way sunlight eases through the cracks of an old window. For months, she had moved through the grand halls of the James family mansion like a shadow, unseen, unheard, unimportant. Every smile she forced felt heavy, and every breath she took carried the weight of expectations that were never hers to bear. Yet she endured, because she loved James. And loving him meant waiting, hoping, wishing for something that would anchor their fragile marriage. Lately, however, her body had been whispering secrets she did not dare believe. The sudden waves of dizziness, the strange warmth in her chest, the way she would pause mid-task as if listening to a voice only she could hear, Diep brushed them aside. Probably stress, she told herself, even when her hands trembled against the kitchen counter in the early mornings. The mansion was not a kind place for her. The atmosphere itself drained her spirit. James, buried in the chaos of his company's troubles, barely noticed her pale cheeks or the tired glow in her eyes. He would kiss her forehead before leaving at dawn, not sensing the way her body leaned toward him, as if silently begging him to stay. She wanted to tell him everything, her anxieties, her exhaustion, her secret hope. But each day he seemed further away. When the dizziness worsened, Diep finally gathered the courage to visit the small clinic near her parents' old village. She went alone, quietly, without telling anyone. She sat in the waiting room with her hands clasped tightly, her heart pounding like a small bird trapped in her chest. She feared disappointment. She feared hope. She feared both too much. "Mrs. Diep," the doctor called gently. She entered the room, trembling. A few simple tests, a quiet moment, a soft smile from the doctor, and her world shifted. "You're pregnant, around 6 weeks." The words hit her like a wave of light, warm, overwhelming, unstoppable. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Tears blurred her vision as she placed a trembling hand over her stomach. A new life. James's child. Their child. She had been waiting for this for so long that the truth felt unreal. On the silent ride home, Diep held the ultrasound paper against her heart. Hope, for the first time in a long time, glowed inside her like a living flame. She whispered to the little life within her, voice breaking, "You're my miracle, and your father will be so happy." But deep down, a faint fear flickered. What if he wasn't? Diep spent the entire evening drifting through the mansion like someone who had just been handed a fragile treasure. Every movement felt different, lighter, softer, filled with a quiet glow that almost frightened her. She wanted to run to James the moment he stepped through the front door, take his hands, press them gently over her belly, and whisper the truth that had changed her world. But James never came home that night. The clock struck 9 p.m., then 11, then crept toward midnight. Diep sat on the sofa, wrapped in a thin blanket, fingers tracing the edges of the ultrasound photo she had hidden inside her pocket. She kept imagining his reaction, his smile, the warmth in his eyes, the way he might lift her off the ground in pure happiness. She imagined the two of them standing together, stronger than ever, finally bound by something no one could break. But the mansion remained silent. Only the faint sound of Father James' footsteps echoed upstairs, a reminder of the cold walls that separated her from the rest of the family. She knew he disliked her. He had never truly accepted her. If he found out before James did, Diep's stomach tightened with fear. When morning came and James still hadn't returned, Diep's hope twisted into worry. She found herself pacing the living room, hand unconsciously resting over her abdomen. The little life inside her was too new, too delicate, and already she felt fiercely protective. She tried calling him, but his phone was off. She messaged him, but there was no reply. By noon, exhaustion swept over her. She sat by the window, watching the sunlight dance across the garden. She wanted to believe James was simply busy. His company had been facing endless problems, missing shipments, unpredictable investors, suspiciously timed obstacles. He was drowning in stress, trying to protect the empire he had built with his own hands. But this time felt different. Deep in her chest, a strange heaviness settled, as if life was warning her that what was ahead would not be easy. That afternoon, a maid approached her timidly. "Mrs. Diep, Father James wishes to see you." Her heart dropped. She followed the maid through the cold hallway, clutching the railing for support. The doctor had told her to avoid stress, to stay calm. But how could she, when she was being led directly into the lion's den? Father James stood by the window of his office, hands clasped behind his back, face like stone. "You look pale," he said, without turning around. "Is something wrong?" Diep opened her mouth, but the truth caught in her throat. She wasn't ready to tell him. She wasn't ready to face the storm, not alone. And most of all, she wasn't ready to admit the question that had been haunting her since yesterday. Where was James? Father James finally turned to face her, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "James hasn't returned home," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "And you seem troubled." Diep's fingers curled against her dress. She lowered her gaze, afraid that if she met his eyes, he would somehow see straight into her secret, straight into the tiny heartbeat she was carrying inside her. I'm fine," she whispered. "You are not fine." His voice hardened. "This family already has enough problems. I hope you are not adding to them." The words struck her like cold water. He didn't know. Not yet. But he sensed something was wrong, and that alone was enough to make fear coil in her stomach. "I only want to know where James is," Diep said softly. "He didn't come home last night." Father James studied her face carefully. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, concern, guilt in his eyes, but it disappeared too quickly. "He left for a business meeting, a very important one." "Where?" Diep asked. "That is none of your concern." His tone dropped like a final judgment. Then, without another word, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Diep stepped out of the office, her breath trembling. Her heart pounded as if warning her. Something was terribly wrong. James wouldn't disappear without telling her. Not after everything they had been through. Not after all the battles they fought side by side. Unless he couldn't contact her? That thought sent a shiver through her. She hurried back to their bedroom, opened the wardrobe, and pulled out his laptop. Maybe she could find a clue, an email, a message, anything. But the moment she lifted the lid, a password screen appeared. She knew his old passwords, but none of them worked. He had changed it. Recently. Her chest tightened. Why would he do that? A sudden knock startled her. It was Tuan, one of James's most trusted employees. His face was pale. His shirt wrinkled and sweat glistened on his forehead. "Mrs. Diep, I need to talk to you." She felt her heart stock. "Is it about James?" she whispered. Tuan swallowed hard. "Yes." Her breath caught in her lungs. "What happened? Where is he?" Tuan looked around nervously before stepping inside and closing the door. "James, he didn't go to a meeting," he said in a trembling voice. "He was taken." Diep felt the room tilt.
Taken? By who? Tuan hesitated, his lips trembling. By someone in his own family.
Diep felt her knees weaken. Someone in his own family? The walls of the room seemed to shrink around her, squeezing her breath. Tuan, tell me everything, she demanded, her voice shaking. Tuan inhaled sharply, as if gathering courage. It was Father James. He ordered people to take James away. The words slammed into her like a punch. No, no, that can't be true. Her voice trembled, yet deep inside, she knew. Father James had always considered her unworthy. He hated how James chose her over family reputation, over money, over status. But to go this far? Tuan nodded slowly. James discovered something about the land dispute between your families years ago. He confronted his father, and that night, he disappeared. A cold chill spread through Diep's body. Her heart instinctively curled around the small life growing inside her. Our child, what kind of world will you be born into? Tuan, where is he now? She asked. I don't know, he admitted, but I think Father James sent him abroad, forced him into a remote branch company where he can't return or contact anyone. Why? Her voice cracked. To separate him from you, Tuan answered, and to make sure you eventually leave on your own. Diep pressed her hand to her stomach, her breath hitching. So that was it. Father James wanted to break them apart, not by arguments, not by threats, but by removing the man she loved from her life entirely. Her tears stung, but she refused to let them fall. James needed her. Their baby needed her. This was not the time to be weak. What should I do? She whispered, more to herself than to Tuan. His eyes softened. I believe James left something for you. Before he disappeared, he asked me to give you this, when the time felt right. Tuan reached into his jacket and took out a small black flash drive. Her breath caught. What's on it? She asked. I haven't seen it, but James said, if anything happened to him, this would guide you to the truth. Her hands shook as she accepted it. A message from James, a clue he left behind, a hope she desperately needed. Suddenly, footsteps echoed outside the door, heavy, authoritative, unmistakably familiar. Diep's eyes widened in fear. Tuan froze. The knob turned. Father James stepped inside, his expression dark as thunder. His gaze dropped to the flash drive in Diep's hand. So, he said softly, dangerously, you found it. Diep instinctively stepped back, clutching the flash drive close to her heart. But Father James moved forward, unhurried, merciless. Give it to me, he ordered. But Diep shook her head, her fear turning into fierce determination. No, no, this time? Behind her trembling voice was a new strength. The strength of a woman fighting for her husband, for her child, for the truth.